Hello and welcome to From Queen Anne to Queen Victoria Chats. I'm really happy that you decided to spend this evening with us and that you want to listen to our two professors discussing all things Neo-Victorian. The title is Neo-Victorianisms with an S because we'll be talking about Neo-Victorian fiction, Neo-Victorian studies, Neo-Victorian, well, you name it. If there's something that we will not cover, let us know during the Q&A. I'm sure it will be addressed. Just to remind you, the Q&A will take place after the conversation. So you may use the Zoom function and raise your hand if you want to ask the question. Or you may put it into the chat box and I'll read it out and then our guests will address that question. If you want to comment on anything in the meantime, do so. If you want to ask a question in the chat while the conversation is happening, you may also do that. Just please signal that this is a question, right? So put the capital Q into the chat box, and I'd like to ask you to keep your microphones muted during the conversation, okay? Just yeah, thank you. Yes, let's turn to our guests. Before I say a few words about them, because they hardly need introduction, but still, I'd like to just say that I chose Neo-Victorianism as the topic of today's meeting because it's very close to my heart, and this is the first chat, and I was really happy that both Professor Arias and Professor Babilas agreed to take part in this conversation. As you know, Professor Arias is based at the University of Malaga in Spain, and Dorota Babilas represents University of Warsaw and our research group, because that's the idea that for the chat, that we look at a certain topic from, let's say, an inside and outside perspective. Inside being someone from our research group and the guest that we've invited. So Professor Arias, as you know, has been working on Neo-Victorianism for quite a while now. She co-edited quite a few very important collections. One of them is Neo-Victorian, the text on haunting and spectrality in Neo-Victorian fiction. And for those of you who maybe don't remember this one, here's a link. You may have a look at it in the meantime. Recently, she also co-edited a special issue of Victoriographies. And again, let me pop into the link to that. This issue was on tracing the Victorians, material uses of the past in Neo-Victorianism. And if I'm not mistaken, in the audience, we've got someone who actually contributed to that issue. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A later when our audiences, when they join us. Professor Arias also wrote on landscapes and queer phenomenology and jewelry, Victorian jewelry, quite recently, and I'm sure that those some of those issues will be mentioned in the conversation as well. So once again, thank you for joining us today and being with us. And Dorota Babilas, who I've been working with her for quite a while. She, as some of you know, she's interested in Neo-Victorian arts and fashion, opera, musical theatre. The Phantom of the Opera is as if her thing. She wrote a text for the latest Polish edition of the novel she writes and presents a lot on reception of Victorianisms in the 20th century and 21st century, screen culture, the screen depictions, adaptations. And again, let me just maybe link, give you a link to one of her texts. It's indirect. It leads first to our website, where she wrote something about the chapter that she published in a collection on Hammer, House of Horror and Victorian monsters. So here it is. And also she wrote a book on representation of Queen Victoria in popular culture. This one was published in Polish, but here's the link as well. And actually 10 years ago, if you can imagine, we worked on together on a collection of essays, which we entitled "We the Neo-Victorians." 10 years, time flies. If anyone is interested in that, let me know either in the chat or send us an email and we'll see what we can do about it. Right, so Dorota, again, thank you as well for joining us. And yes, I'll be quiet for for a while because the conversation will be mostly between our two guests. I'll be just directing it or redirecting it. We'll see how it develops. So I thought that we could divide it into 3 parts. The first about Victorian pasts, and again, plural here, about neo-Victorian present and possible futures. And I'd like to start with a personal question, rather personal question, which would be about your entry into neo-Victorianism. And, you know, when, what text it was, and whether it was love at first sight.
Okay, thank you, Lucina. Thank you for the introduction. I'm so happy to see all the people here. I recognize some names. I'm very happy to see you and thank you for coming. And Lucina, I hope you join in. You're a specialist in your own right, and
I might chip in
quite a lot about especially Victorian or neo-Victorian villains and detectives and other fascinating things, like I know the dark history of London. So lots of topics to fit in. But as for my entry into the world of the Neo-V, it wasn't actually typical neo-Victorianism at first. As you said, it was the Phantom of the Opera. So back in 1992, when I was a student at the Institute of English Studies here at the University of Warsaw, I got the original cast recording of Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical, The Phantom of the Opera, as a present from a friend. And it just hit me on the head. It was, you know, what you call sometimes the standout syndrome. I just wanted everything. It just clicked. I've been wondering for 30 years, like why, but I have different hypotheses. But then I just found my place in the culture world, let's say. I wanted everything, like everything opera, everything musical theater, everything 19th century. And especially what I really got thrilled by were the modern reworkings of classical texts. So that's how it started, I think. So that was the beginning for me.
So the beginning for me, first of all, thank you so much for having me as a guest. It's such a pleasure. It's a privilege to be here, to be inaugurating this QA and QV chats. And thank you so much for being here, friends and colleagues. It's wonderful to see you here on the screen as well. I have a secret to confess. I think not many people know how I really got in contact with neo-Victorianism. So I was living in Westerville. That was in 2002. I was also a commuter going to Brunel, where I met my, friend Patricia Pullum, and I was in my bedroom just typing on my computer, and I happened to see people filming on the beach in Westerville, and this was going to be Deep in the Velvet. So that was honestly my first entry into Neo-Victorianism. Of course, I had read Victorian novels. I had very good teachers as well, and I enjoyed my Victorian novels. But my entry into Neo-Victorianism was through filming Deep in the Velvet on the Westerville beach. And then Patricia just lent me Affinity, Waters Affinity, that really impacted me. So it was reading Affinity and being a commuter and living both in Westerville and London that really attracted me to the genre. And since then, I think I've never stopped being in love with Neo-Victorianism. So it's a long-standing relationship, but hopefully it will continue like this for a long time. So now you know my secret is out. So thank you
for sharing.
Sharing worldwide.
Yeah. What was it like watching them filming? How much of the work in progress have you actually seen?
It was only people dressed in costume, and it was just, I remember it was a long time ago, so you may imagine. So it was a boat turned upside down and people dressed in very kind of old clothes, but I hadn't read Deep in the Velvet by then, so I couldn't make a connection. And then made a connection later when after Affinity I read Deep in the Velvet. I was such a shock.
Did you come up and talk to them?
No, of course not. I was so shy, and it was a long distance. I was quite close to the beach, but I didn't dare just come up and say, well, what are you filming about? It was later that I realized that it was Deep in the Velvet. It was wonderful, really.
No, Benedict Cumberbatch was there.
Really, I forgot that.
Yeah, he had a small role of the abandoned fiancé of the main heroine.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So both of you got into Neo-Victorianism not through literature, which is how it's supposed to have started. But before we talk about the beginnings, I'd like to ask you about the term itself, because we talk about Neo-Victorianism, but there were a few ideas as to what we should be calling these texts that address the past, right? So we've had various prefixes, like the post was advocated, or retro, faux, and so on and so forth. So why do you think neo is the one that we keep using? Why not post, which also kind of makes sense? Why not retro, which is so retro? What's your take?
I don't know. Shall I say something about it? Because I remember this is the benefits of being now old in that respect, because I remember the Langen conference. I can't remember the year right now, but in the Langen conference a long time ago, we were discussing the prefixes, and Sally Shuttleworth was the one who had used retro in the past to refer to Bayard's Angels and Insects, for example. And she said that once she was aware of Neo-Victorianism, she was changing her mind into not retro, but rather neo. So it was a very nice transition into possible prefixes, obviously implying different attitudes to the whole movement, and how eventually I think we sort of agreed on using neo, and especially Sally Shuttleworth herself transitioning from retro into the neo as perhaps having a more positive, forward-looking ring to it. I don't know what you think, Dorota.
I think neo really sums it all nicely, because it's a two-way street. It's not only trying the modern or postmodern interpreters trying to imitate the Victorian period or the 19th century, but really doing something innovative with it, and especially seeing it through the perspective of modern theoretical framework, modern frame of mind, let's say. So the retro wouldn't really fit here. As for post, that would be anything that went after, not necessarily making any contact or trying to make contact with the original mode or style. So, perhaps for some humorous turns, for some satirical takes on that, but I think Neo just sums it all, and I'm not surprised that's the one that's really sticked.
Also, I think the Neo suggests this kind of double-oriented movement that we find in Neo-Victorianism, because it's both a comment on the Victorian age, but also obviously we relate to it. It's about today's preoccupations. So I think the Neo is to see things in a new different lens. So it emphasizes this double-oriented, also double movement, that it has been as well used as characteristic of the whole Neo-Victorian mode.
It's been really so obsessed with the lasting legacy, for good and bad, of the Victorian period. So it's really the endurance of Victorianism that's, I think, essential for this genre or style.
That's it, yeah.
Those who are following the chat, there was a comment from one of your students about Rosario, about you saying something like that about that in class, right? Which is yeah. So that was about the faux. Yes, and so and you mentioned this new perspective. So those preoccupations. That were as if added, and I'd like to talk about that in a moment as well. But first, I'd like to ask how new in terms of being new is it? Because we had this great boom in the 1990s. We see the beginnings of this approach to Victorian text in the 60s. But actually, I came across also a statement that Arthur Conan Doyle was the first neo-Victorian, because he started rewriting his very Victorian character as he was going along the way. So where would you decide when it started? When did it start?
I wouldn't go as far as Arthur Conan Doyle. I think he was Victorian, at least initially. So I wouldn't really call him a neo-Victorian, but I'd probably go back to the 1960s and the novels that are now seen as the kind of perhaps neo-Victorian avant la lettre. So White Sargassy by Jean Rice in 1966, or The French Lieutenant's Woman in 1969. By John Fowles. So these were basically reinterpretations of either the classical text like Jane Eyre, or some, let's say, generalized Victorian tropes, but in a different mode than before. Because from what I remember reading rather than living through, before, after the death of Queen Victoria and the complete, like, it was like a complete paradigm shift in culture and literary culture, especially in Britain. The Victorians very quickly became the butt of jokes. So and the criticism of Victorian values, Victorian worldview as something stuffy and unattractive and potentially backward, let's say, became quite typical way to address these issues before those novels in the later 60s. And I think it kind of, this was the spark that really took a long while to kindle, but then it inspired this phenomenal outbreak of great works at the turn of the century. What do you think, Rosario?
Yes, I totally agree, because although we find some texts, coded texts in the 20th century that somehow seem to go back to the 19th century, there's a kind of a critical awareness in the 1960s onwards, and also because of the emergence and advent of postmodernism, obviously contributes to this emergence and the awareness that we need to do something about the history that hasn't been told by other voices. And I think those two novels you've mentioned, the White Sagesse of Sea and the French Afternoon's Woman, they're considered to be forerunners, and rightly so, rightly so. Although obviously later, and I always like to give credit to Dana Schiller for the label Neo-Victorian in the 1990s as critically regarding fiction by Bayard and Peter Ackroyd as actually Neo-Victorian. I think the forerunners obviously both White Sagesse of Sea and the French Afternoon's Woman as such. Yes, so I totally agree with you, Dorota.
But then, you know, Bayard and of course Sarah Waters, it was the moment that most people remember as the true beginning of Neo-Victorianism.
Yeah.
And
why the gap?
Yes.
Why the gap?
Sorry. Yeah. And also the adaptations, the possession, the film adaptation of possession adaptations obviously contributed to make the whole phenomenon widespread. So it was obviously the end of the 20th century in which we can find what the beginning, the emergence, and the development of that.
Yeah, because we have the 60s and then 25 years of nothing. But actually, in the meantime, we have heritage culture, right? And Neo-Victorianism as a kind of reaction against, to some extent, criticizing, right? Trying to undermine certain aspects. Yeah.
If we look at adaptations, especially film and television, like BBC adaptations of classic Victorian texts, they tend to shift towards a more kind of problematizing view towards the end of the 20th century. So it's not only the novels, the kind of new creative output with new stories and such, but it's also those new type of adaptations, very much in the discussion with the original text, let's say, rather than just straightforward visual.
Right. So you started talking about those new perspectives and preoccupations and problematizing those texts in a certain way. Apart from this triad of race, class, and gender, what else would you say are the major or where, or have been, depending on when, those major preoccupations of Neo-Victorian texts in terms of fiction, and then we'll turn to Neo-Victorian studies as well.
But to me, it has been, I think, to my perspective, it has been always conceptualizing this dialogue between past and present, trying to find new ways or different ways or various ways of engaging with the past, and in different ways, so different modes. So that's why I have always being interested in concepts or like the trace or haunting spectrality, orientation, things that help us see what kind of relationship we keep with the past. And so attitudes to history, attitudes to past and memory, I think is perhaps one, I don't know if main preoccupation, but it's been one of my main preoccupations. So I don't know, Dorota, what you have to say about that.
think like the first thing I really started noticing were the feminist interpretations or reinterpretations and the whole treatment of women in neo-Victorian fiction, which could range from, let's say, inserting postmodern heroines into classical or kind of classic inspired narratives, to let's say the critique of the Victorian way of treating women. So that was something that was quite important for me, like seeing the Victorian gender roles in a new perspective, with perhaps the queer issues, especially as they were added by Sarah Waters, with some sort of, let's say, extra turn of the focus. The other thing, Gothic, the Gothic mode, and kind of Gothic, the neo-Victorian Gothic, the addition or not of fantastic elements of the monsters and vampires and all that. So I guess this was an interesting take, which was quite visible from the early days of those, let's say, postmodern reworkings of all things Victorian.
Right, and in terms of neo-Victorian studies and the critical approaches, what do you consider to be really milestones? And I'm not asking the ones that are accepted, but the ones that really matter to you.
I've mentioned already Dana Schiller. For me,
yes.
Obviously, I mean, in terms of fiction, I've said Affinity, and I was Patricia, my friend, who really gave me the book. But in terms of critical approaches, and I remember reading the article. I remember reading that long article. It was later monograph, but it was an article that she wrote, and it was so eye-opening that I think it was 1997, which was quite early in neo-Victorian studies, and not much had been published on that. And she uses the label neo-Victorian as much as we are using it today. So for me, it's a must in the field. I don't know, there are so many, but that's why I want just to say this as a founding text for me at the beginning.
I think I would probably choose some text from the turn of the century, when this was just beginning. So I noted down a few titles like Kate Mitchell's History and Cultural Memory in Neo-Victorian Fiction, or Louisa Hadley's Neo-Victorian Fiction and Historical Narrative. But there is this whole series of Kolke and Goodleben's
I'm leaving all our
books on different aspects of neo-Victorian culture and literature, like, I know, what was it? Trauma and
City, and you have and Anne and Mark Lewin's co-authored book, and there's so many of them, and we are leaving our friends and colleagues out, I'm sure. So but really foundational texts that they have shaped the whole genre. So yes, absolutely, I totally agree with you also.
I think there are so many interesting books really appearing still, like the one that you co-edited with Patricia Poulan on Haunting and Spectrality. It's just just a new take on that, and I think it's not a dead end of theory and literary criticism, so definitely not.
No, definitely not. No, a lot is happening. Right. So for me, when it comes to because you mentioned fiction as well, but in terms of neo-Victorian classics and fiction, that's for me definitely the book that was published 20 years ago in 2002, and that's The Crimson Petal and the White. which is such a fantastic text to study and to unpack. And it instantly became a Neo-Victorian classic. And I wonder whether you, what do you think about this particular text? That would be one thing. And any other classics, the text that really quickly became classics, Neo-Victorian classics.
I love it. I love it. That's well, as for classics, I would definitely say the Neo-Victorian trilogy by Sarah Waters. This is like the text that will be mentioned in any kind of anthology or any discussion of Neo-Victorianism. So that's definitely it.
As for Pinson Peasant the White, I absolutely agree. It's absolutely gem. And I remember that Mel Corky recently has also applied ethical criticism to the novel. So it lends itself to so many readings.
Yeah.
So I think it very rightly belongs to some kind of a classic text. For me, it's been as well Sarah Waters. I'm not original in that respect, but I think it was as well through Bayard in the 1990s. And there's one text it was Belinda Starling. She wrote one novel, The Journal of Dora Damage, and I don't know if you remember that text. I think she only wrote one novel because she's very sadly, she passed away. And for me, that's also a novel that we should, I think, revise and reread. It's a wonderful novel. It's a shame that she passed away. So and we couldn't just enjoy more novels written by her. But that was also I'm not in semi-classic, but one text that deserves to be included in the list of excellent texts, Neo-Victorian texts.
Yeah, we have some support for that in the chat as well. Yeah. Okay, and if slightly turning towards the present, because those texts, some of them could be called neo-sensational, neo-Gothic, neo-this, neo-that. This hybridity of Neo-Victorianism, is it, and more fans of Crimson Petal. Great. So this hybridity, do you consider it as something that helps attracting wider audiences, or is it something that makes things easier for the critics and academics to analyze, to look for new angles and perspectives?
I think it was inevitable. I think it's so postmodern to mash up and to rearrange things and to add new perspectives. If you have neo-Victorianism, why not neo-Regency? Why not interwar period, neo-Edwardian? It's happening. It is definitely happening. And those stylistic hybridities, so the Gothic mashups and steampunk, definitely. Steampunk is such a genre or style that really entered neo-Victorian sensibility. So I don't know, what's the title? The Parasol Protectorate.
The series, yeah,
the series by Gail Carriger.
Yes.
It's funny, it's quirky, it has classic Victorian monsters and feminist heroine, and what's not to like?
Yes, I think it makes also, it is inevitable, as you said, and it makes readers have more access to other texts, and this kind of hybridity makes the text as well more interesting. So I think why not, as you say, neo interwar novel neo-Renaissance as well. So what is it? I think it's quite positive, in fact, to have this genre hybridization, and it makes the whole text more interesting in having this possible mashups and coming pieces together in different ways. Absolutely.
So some critics would say that once certain genre or subgenre hits the mainstream, it gets diluted, right? Steampunk was steampunk, and then everyone was wearing it. You had major fashion brands organizing, creating pseudo or full, maybe we should say, steampunk outfits. So do you think that there's a danger that neo-Victorianism is actually being kind of, spreading too much? Is it what's happening at the moment or not?
Interesting question, I have to say.
Yeah, it could be. I think this is always a danger of globalized culture and those corporate interests that come to the fore when something gets fashionable. So
perhaps a question for me would be, is there any other period as fascinating as the Victorian age so that it will stick? So is it the neo-18th century novel, for example, is going to stay as much as neo-Victorianism, which is from the late 20th century onwards? So that would be the question, but I'm not prepared to answer it. Is it possible perhaps to use an umbrella term such as neo-historical, and the neo-Victorian seems to be included into that all-encompassing label? I don't know. That's not easy to answer, but it's a very interesting question.
I think right now there is this relatively newfound interest in this kind of neo-Regency style. So they moved earlier in the 19th century, still in the 19th century, but I'm thinking about the new adaptations of Jane Austen things, but also things like Bridgerton, which is completely neo in a different way that classic neo-Victorian, goodness, have been developing. So I guess this is where, let's say, the sexy new additions are, sexy in various terms.
Yeah, because the mashup culture, it became mainstream culture, right? And it's also, Dorota, you mentioned this, refer to that, the question of profit, right? Because it's one thing, what is it that we'd like to read? And the other thing is, what is it that will sell? And what is it that we may use? How can we make sure that we will attract the audiences? And the Victorian, obviously out of copyright, ready to be used, Sherlock Holmes, out of copyright in the United States, all of it as of January the 1st, right? Yeah, and yes, we had a comment in the chat from Chris saying, calling, yes, Jane Austen an honorary neo-Victorian. Yes, yes, but with the
next one down will be Agatha Christie. You'll see.
Yes, quite close. Yes, that's true, because the anniversary effect, right? This is something that always helps, I think, to create a market for a certain, or create certain fashion. Okay, so the mashup culture is one thing, but I think that the other quite big area still at the moment are all those biofictions.
Oh, yes.
So have we run out of Victorian characters? I mean, fictional characters? Have we adapted them? Have we exploded them, or is it just a question of okay, so now they are dead, so let's use them? let's revive them. Let's do something about all those figures. And of course, better still, let's rewrite them so that their lives fit the fiction that they created, right? Because this is something that's really interesting, I think, for me.
Like the one about Emily Bronte, just
For
now.
example.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very common thread now that you have the lives of creatives through their creations. So
yes, that's again some food for thought, because, and again, why certain figures, I remember there was a Henry James year, and where we've got several novels being published in the same year. I think it was 2005. I can't remember the year, but so I know it seems to me that we haven't run out of figures, of course, but just slanting or shifting into other lesser known figures, or perhaps women photographers, women artists. So I think the biopic or the biography is not as yet finished, but it's developing as well. I think I would say something like that. I don't know, Dorota.
yeah, I think this is also another hot issue right now, and it's not really to tell a true story, whatever that means, of a historical character, but to reinterpret them for the new generation of viewers or readers, like Dickinson, Emily Dickinson. There was this like last year, when did it end? The series called Dickinson, which is a complete reimagining of her life, of her poetry, of her views, from a very, I would say, quirky and contemporary perspective.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the more mashup texts we get, the more academic texts about it are produced, the more biofiction is being written, the more is being studied. Do you think that this turn towards material culture, which also has is quite recent, is it here to stay? Is it something, because I had a feeling that we, as if this fascination reflects those comebacks that we have, like, you know, every like 20 or so years, we come back to certain issues and we explore them again. Victoriana was yet another term that was used, but mostly to refer to all those physical things that the Victorians had left, those physical traces, right? And it was there for a while, then it disappeared somehow, or hidden shadows, and now we talk about those neo-Victorian things again. So do you think this is where we are going, actually? And do you think that the current situation, I'm talking about the economic crisis, I'm talking about the ecological crisis, do you think that it will make people look back and rediscover the frugality of the Victorians, for example? Because this is something that was obvious years ago. Then it was taken over by mass production, and now we are as if, are we coming back to that? Do you think this interest in materiality, do you see a connection there? Or?
Well, I think Danielle Duff, who's here, will have.
Yes, I was thinking, yes.
I'm interested in materiality and in new theories about materiality myself. So is it because we have so many tangible relics and traces from the Victorians? It's so easy perhaps to go to an antique shop or to go and to get an old photograph or a keepsake, that perhaps we find ourselves attached to those objects. Or so I think it's because we are still attached to that, and we, not to go back for any, to my mind, not for any kind of nostalgic, but also to feel the attachment to something which is quite tangible, down to earth, perhaps in a world which is so disembodied, and I'm sorry about the medium today, but we need to perhaps grasp something that is real, that we feel that is real, authentic between inverted commas, to make up for this disconnection or disembodiment that perhaps we feel not only through the online medium, but also in the day-to-day, daily activities. We find, particularly after the pandemic, a bit disconnected with others. So it might be a way of connecting ourselves to history, to the past. So something we feel is real, is tangible. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
It does, yeah. And the comments in the chat also were, yes.
I think the pandemic exposed much of it, with people stuck in their homes during the lockdown, and there was this massive wave of reimagining the world and kind of stylization. There was this massive wave of different homemade things and crafts and knitting and I don't know, making preserves and such thing, and those rather imaginative styles in clothing, which would really reinterpret and reuse the vintage clothes in a new context, like this whole thing about dark academia. Noticed, which was basically the response of the student culture to the fact that it was basically all online, and they wanted to have a university experience. So they were coming up with the idea to make the online university more authentic and more real by referring to all kinds of fashions and quirks all the way back to the 19th century. There were other such styles, I don't know, cottagecore, and you would probably name some more, but it was all the search of handmade things, reused vintage things, and authenticity in the increasingly digitalized and online world.
Yeah, it seems to me that this economic aspect is closer to politics. So, maybe it's not reflected in fiction yet, but I think it will be if you think about those recent rereadings over the Christmas period of Christmas Carol, which again was looked at not just for the ghosts and Scrooge, but the social aspect, the poverty, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure Chris, might add something to that later. Right. So if I could come back to this, is it here to stay? This material aspect. How soon do you think we might get fed up and move to something else? I mean, I'm not talking about we here, but as a general interest.
When it becomes globalized and commercialized, that's my answer.
I think it might develop into a focus on blurred boundaries between materiality, human and human. And I was thinking as Dorota was speaking about the fern craze in the Victorian times and the plant craze over the pandemic, in which it seems that the human and the non-human living in very enclosed spaces were so replicating in a way this fern craze and the plant craze we had in the Victorian period for different reasons. So it might be the material evolves into a more comprehensive view of the world, a more kind of encompassing not only materiality, but how materiality and immateriality, or the human and the non-human, intermingles and co-work. I don't know. That's my feeling. But
Any other predictions for the future of Neo-Victorianism, either in terms of fiction or Neo-Victorian studies?
I think there will be. This is something that's observable in film and television. There will be more supernatural and kind of, the Carnival Row which is not exactly neo-Victorian, but
But
say
the aesthetics of it.
the aesthetics is inspired by
Mhm.
the 19th century, and there is a strong element of social criticism, class issues and such, masked through this kind of fantasy, gothic, supernatural stuff.
Mhm.
And also,
So coming back to haunting spectrality.
The ghosts never die.
never
Yeah.
die. Yes, they come back by returning. So returning and coming back. And I was thinking as well of, in terms of future, orientation, transnational, more transnational and more, Neo-Victorian communities at work as today, for example.
Mhm.
That's why this is a wonderful initiative, and to be able to just discuss and chat across countries, across cultures, in a more transnational way. I think that's the future, and that's why I really congratulate you on that initiative in focusing and strengthening links, across the Anglophone area into other countries. So that would be as well my wishful thinking for the future.
Thank you very much. And it's leads us very nicely towards my final questions, because we've planned this talk for more or less 1 hour, and it's almost yes, time flies. So yes, those 3 more questions that I'd like to ask, and I'd like each of you to answer. But actually, I've just realized that I've already asked the first one. We've already touched upon it, about your beloved text. So we'll skip this one. But let's reverse it. Is there a text that you would not recommend?
Nah.
Something.
Why would you even say that?
I don't know.
Saying that every book has a page or a paragraph that saves it, and every film has a minute that saves it. So, and you just need to explore. There will be things that you will like, there will be things that you will not like, but it's really hard to make such recommendations, or especially the kind of anti-recommendations to people, because what you may find something completely kind of meh, and then it proves to be life-changing for somebody else. So.
And yes. I totally agree. Sometimes the text you don't like when you're in your 20s, you like it when you're in your 40s.
Oh, so absolutely. They grow on you sometimes.
Wait and see. No, absolutely. I wouldn't say nothing against them.
And I just realized that I kind of lied, because I said, I don't know why I asked that question, but I think I know why I asked this question, because the texts that I'm reading and researching right now are judged by many as being rubbish. And I'm saying, well, no, we cannot, talk like that. And every adaptation, every rewriting is worth examining, because it says something, and then it feeds back into this whole culture, because it stays. There are traces of it everywhere. So
if something is, in your opinion or somebody's opinion, rubbish, it can actually irritate you and make you think. I think the worst reaction is kind of bland.
Yeah.
If you find something you actively are peeved by, I think it's a valuable point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I was really actually surprised, because yesterday I just got one of the books and one of the stories, and I was reading it. I was like, right, yes, there is something that really, yes, speaks to me a lot out of this whole collection. But okay, so the final question, which may or may not be related to your beloved text question. If someone wanted to start their neo-Victorian adventure, where would you tell them to start? What text? would you recommend? Starting point.
It's a difficult one. I don't know. I would say that most people who are here have already started, so they don't probably need the recommendation for an entry point. And I would
True.
say that usually you push one door and the whole world opens. So it doesn't really matter through which door you enter. It matters where you go from there.
So yes, basically, I wouldn't recommend any in particular. Just be open, explore, and also follow your instinct in choosing a text. That's it.
Great.
If you happen to find something that resonates with you at your particular moment, just don't let it go. Just explore and see what's there and find something similar or something, I don't know, that might lead you further.
Okay, thank you. I think that's that. We looked at the past, we talked about the present, we looked into the future, we speculated a bit. So thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you for your insight, recommendations, suggestions, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and to what the audience has to say. So thank you for this one.
Thank you.
And I'm looking forward to other from Queen Anne to Queen Victoria chats in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.